Hi, my name is Aris Mejias with Behind the Scenes for PHLAFF, Philadelphia Latino filmmaker, and we have today Nadia Barbossa, which is the producer of La Ultima Gira and a documentary. Could you remind me the translation of that documentary?
Yes, the name is Cockfights the Last Season. In Spanish is Gallos de Pelea la Última Temporada.
So we have Nadia here, and this behind the scenes is specifically geared towards giving voice to women and minorities. So many of the questions are framed within that framework, where I'm trying to ascertain who has decision-making power in many of the productions that we are seeing currently. Yes. So let's start. Your name, the name of the films, you've already said it. What is your role in these productions?
I am the producer, but I want to make the distinction, and in both cases, I'm a creative producer. Sometimes producers are just, creating the infrastructure of a film from the development until the distribution, but in this case, I'm also part of the creative process, which is, from the script, from the very, the writing of the script and helping the director, come up with ideas about how to rewrite the script until, the very end with the publicity and marketing of the film. So in that sense, I consider myself in both cases a creative producer.
Is that a term that you coined, or is that something that exists within the industry and people know about?
It is a term that exists within the industry. I mean, not every project, I don't think every project has a creative producer. I think it's a personal decision that you take on a project, and if you want to be involved in the creative process, then you just become organically a creative producer. I'm not a creative producer in every project that I do. But in these two cases, I, choose to be part of the project because I'm also involved in making sure that I'm part of that creative process.
Knowing you personally, I know that that's what you do, but I didn't know that that was a term, and that's the reason why I like working with you, because you are very involved, and most of the projects will have your signature on them. So interesting. So I guess now my questions of I don't know if you know the work of the Guerrilla Girls. It's a group of women that in the 70s started creating numbers and data for how many painters were in museums that were women versus men, and how many women as in content were put in those paintings, naked or otherwise, versus men. And the data they gathered was pretty astounding, and it started creating change on the perception of museum goers, but also in the funding for artwork that was bought for museum. So in that sense, these questions are geared to that. I don't know if you have all the answers to it. I was very interested in knowing how many women in key positions for, let's say, a big budget movie like La Ultima Gira did you have?
I would say department heads. It was myself as a producer. I'm the only producer. I have an executive producer. There's also women, along with two men. But as an executive producer, there's one, and I as a producer two. Then there's a hair and makeup head, and the wardrobe designer. So
in total, you would have four women.
I would say yes. Leading departments, we had 4 women.
What are the total number of positions in the movie, and like the one that you had, even post-production?
Do you have any crew? You mean the department heads or?
Yeah, department heads in total. Like 20?
Well, there's I would say 4, 5 or 6 departments. So because there's an art department that was a man. But it's very interesting this question, because when I set up to do with film, I don't necessarily see if it's a man or a woman that I'm hiring, although I am much more conscious about it because all of these things that are going on around the world and all these conversations that people are having about being more inclusive and allowing women to have these roles.
Right.
However, when I do a film, I try to get the person that will do the best job. So for that particular film, and I think every film has the right people that are going to do it. Nevertheless, I think it's extremely important to allow for women to show their work so that they can be in the pool of people that can be chosen for a specific to lead those departments.
I asked the question
Initially,
because that same conclusion that you have just arrived to, which is that like you want the best person to be in the job, but then when we don't open up the question of how many, like you don't even consider it, then you just don't go like, wait, let me see if there is someone that has not been considered before, because usually there's
right.
more opportunities for men, and
Yeah.
I don't want to be
And
discriminatory.
and to follow up on that point, it is exactly that, because they've had the chance before as a first option. They probably have more experience,
Yeah.
more work to show, so that may be considered, better fit for the job, when not necessarily, because women don't have that much work to show. In this case, I mean, I don't think it's the case. I think we chose who was best for the job. However, I was highly conscious about, bringing in women and making sure that they were able to sit on the table and express whatever they can bring to the project. And I definitely was much more conscious about that with the last tour. With the cockfights documentary, I was the only woman.
Well, I wanted to also
for the entire shoot, because not only was the crew base all men, but the places that we were shooting in we were shooting cockfights all over Puerto Rico.
It was all men. I only saw 3 women. It was 2 girls, the daughters of some guy, and then this little girl holding a cock. Like I was shocked, and I was really, really surprised, because I'm doing this series on women, and then I'm trying to see if having a woman producer will bring about more women-based stories. And then you find a documentary where it's just what it is. It's just what it is.
I think it takes me back to my years of high school when I was growing up. When you have these conversations with your guidance counselors, they don't necessarily tell you that film or filmmaking or journalism or these types of professions are necessarily for women. So you don't even conceive that you might be working in a film. So when you end up working in the film industry, it kind of is by chance. It's not because you necessarily chose that profession, because you're an artist and then you ended up in the film industry, or you're a writer and journalist, which was my case. I went to journalism school, and you kind of have a good grasp on writing and the media, and then you navigate and end up in film, but not necessarily when you're in high school. At least where I grew up, they don't tell you this is a career that you can have. Film is an option. Acting is an option. Producing is an option. Writing scripts is an option.
I think it's changing. I think right now we are a different generation from the current one, where I went to school. I went to theater school because there was no film school. Right now there are film schools in Puerto Rico and elsewhere, but when I started, it wasn't. you know,
Right.
you kind
And
of
I
have to
don't
do.
think you necessarily have to go to film school to study film. I think in my case, I loved film and I loved documentaries. That's the reason why I got into this thing. But I think to me, it was important to know a lot about a lot of things so that when, you know, it was time for me to choose topics or films that I was going to do, you kind of had a bigger sense of what the world is, and, you know, you felt confident in doing it because you had some sort of knowledge of it.
I didn't know you studied
Whatever.
journalism, which also explains a lot. So I guess another question I wanted to ask, there's two questions which I'm gonna come back to, but right now, gearing up with your background, how many years have you been a producer and how many films have you produced?
I've been, it's funny because I don't never call myself a producer. I just love making films and love making films with people that have the same passion for them.
What would you
So,
call yourself then? I mean, besides creative producer, what, content creator?
yeah, sure. I do feel myself as a content creator. I mean, and a collaborator in creating content, because you never do something
By
by
yourself.
at least in my case, you know, and it's, you know, everybody has so many great ideas and it's just putting them together. And as a producer, you make them happen in a way, but obviously there's a lot of collaboration in the whole process. So yes, I call myself a producer, but I don't.
I love it. I love it. I really think I really think it highlights the type of work that you have done, that I have known you to do, but also the type of work that we actually do in filmmaking, which is very collaborative. And that is what we're trying to highlight in terms of like allowing people to be able to voice whatever they want or whatever they think is best for the project.
Right.
Which ties
So,
into
and I think what I meant was a producer, just the word, it sounds very technical. And I think there's so much passion and I give so much importance to whatever I'm doing that I want to take out the technical aspect of calling, you know, myself a producer and just like I'm helping make something happen. And in this case, it's a film that has great importance to me and to the people that are doing it with me. So it's just a collaborative process of a product that is important to us.
okay.
I would consider myself the lead in, you know, walking this product.
Pushing a big truck full of rocks.
Hey, it's very hard making a film, and it's harder. I mean, I can't speak for other Latin American countries, but I speak for my experience in Puerto Rico, and it's very, very hard making films.
So this is also the reason why I was interested in not interviewing actors or the directors, because there is a lot of voice in what they do, and visibility. To me, it was really important to see how the people who are actually pulling the strings to make things happen, and who are they? So I'm gonna make one question, which is pending because I have to make it, and then I will keep going on with the funding. But how do you have an idea of what your BIPOC, which means Black, Indigenous, people of color, or LGBT crew that you have in your crews, like department heads or anything?
Yeah, that's a tricky question in the sense that I think that in Puerto Rico in particular, some people may feel of a certain race, but they don't necessarily have the physicalities to, you know,
Yeah.
My editor is very light skinned, but he considers himself a Black man. So I wouldn't assume that someone is of a certain race, at least in Puerto Rico, or of a, you know, any a sexual preference or gender preference, or I don't know. I can, you know, make certain assumptions, but I think I would probably be mistaken if I would make those assumptions based on looks. And unfortunately, and this is something that's interesting that you ask, because I think it's important that we're inclusive, but maybe the way to make it more inclusive is right at the beginning of when you're hiring someone with the start paperwork. If they want to answer certain questions that would give us an idea of who we're hiring, and if we're, you know, being inclusive in that sense, you know, making sure that people from different races are represented. And again, I'm talking about the experience in Puerto Rico. We don't have all the races here. We have a certain
Well,
certain
I
groups.
ask because again, I know it's a very delicate subject because it opens the door to discrimination on any point, on any reference point. But for me, the fact that it should be part of the conversation could be either from, as you say, the start of paperwork, or as like in the very beginning when you were given, you know, when I started filmmaking, there were no sexual harassment workshops. But then as time progressed and bigger productions came about, the conversation became about not having sexual harassment within the workplace. So there has to be a common ground of how we address differences and preferences within our crew, either gender or racial identification, self-identification, which would open the table to newer ideas. Because
Absolutely.
again, we need more representation by either telling the stories or by either having voices within the creative process and within the decision making.
I 100% agree. However, unfortunately, in these two films that I made, I didn't ask those questions. With the documentary, it was like we were only 5 people in the crew, and with the feature, I can't justify why I didn't do it. I know it was very present in my mind, but again, I know that in our film industry, there are people from all the different races that, you know, you kind of know that everybody is included, not necessarily in the creative process, but, you know, in the technical crew, you feel that, you know, there's as much representation as you can have in a film. But I do agree that at least when you're doing films that has idiosyncrasies of a particular country, it is important. And I think the work of the actors is very important, this in the sense that when you have a script, but then when they come to interpret these characters, they bring so much to the table, not only, you know, their acting experience, but also their life experience and their work experience. So to me, a script is not ready to shoot until actors have filtered the story through their lens.
And most of the times they will bring in a lot of the subjects.
They bring in so much of the character, but also of the country, which is important. In the last tour, you know, it is based on a real you know, singer. However, all these little things that happen around it were very much done by the actors and what they thought was best for the story. So I think in that sense, the actors, we as producers need to be conscious and allow the space and the conversations to happen so that all these different ideas with the different racial backgrounds or gender preference backgrounds. We need to create that space, and it needs to be a safe space. So when all the heads of departments come in, they're allowed to speak, and they need to be listened, and some need to be executed. Then when you go through the process with the actors, again, having a safe space for them to, you know, bringing what their ideas are. Everybody, you know, open and conscious about, you know, allowing for these inclusions to happen.
Yeah, I know that you do create those spaces because I personally worked in them. And this is the reason why I'm asking questions, because I have been in many of those tables, and
But
I do agree.
I appreciate that question, because it didn't occur to me that, you know, in the start, you know, you have a start paperwork when you're a crew member, because I know you've also worked as a crew member.
Yeah.
You ask your name, your address, certain things, but you don't ask. And I know this is when I filled out forms, you have a choice to answer or not answer. So it can be something that can be integrated in the start paperwork, so that if the person chooses to answer, you have a sense of, you know, who you're hiring.
And also, like, it goes to, like, it creates a safer space of inclusiveness and acceptance. Who knows? I think it's just the start of a very important conversation, where I've had friends who have had a gender preference change. They haven't had, like, you know, change in their bodies,
Yeah.
but they will identify with a certain gender rather than other, or non-binary. And this opens up a whole new concept of communication, but also rethinking everything. It's just like a small thing that will open up a whole new door. And I'm very,
I think it goes both ways also. People that are receiving the information, or the people that are from different races and different gender preferences, sexual preferences, also need to be open with the fact that we may not use, or I may not use, the correct terms. So in a respectful, you know, communication process, I might say something that is not right. And somebody correct me very respectfully, and I will speak to them, you know, respectfully. So if there's respect, and also allowing for people to, I mean, this is just a parenthesis. I was having a conversation with a niece about the pronouns, and it was a very hard concept to grasp, and not that it's not, you can fully understand it, but in the execution, you might make mistakes. So in getting used to executing pronouns correctly, they need to understand that also it's a process. It's like, you know,
we are relearning and rewiring our communication skills. So
sometimes you go like, I'm not even gonna say it because I don't even know if it's right.
Yeah.
So you don't have that conversation. But that's why I say it should go both ways. Us in allowing for these conversations and these things to happen in a safe space, but also other people, everybody understanding that, you know, it might be a process that can take a little longer to get used to.
It's definitely newer generations that have opened my eyes in terms of what we have to reconsider, because in our generation we were the eye openers to our mothers, who were rethinking the fact that we have a bigger sexual liberty, etc., and the ownership of our bodies, which is still being questioned. But, you know, every generation brings about that newness, and in that sense, these series are also geared to that space where I want to have the capacity to talk about it. One, to also let newer filmmakers know what is happening in terms of, like, how we can be more their allies, because I really think that there's a big disconnect of something that is a structure that has been already preset, that we're slowly to open up to women, but it's also needs to open up to BIPOC and LGBT issues. Within that framework, I wanted to ask both these might sound like technical questions, but they're not. I'm interested in knowing, budget wise, like where did you get money and funding? And the reason why I ask this is because newer filmmakers most of the times will grapple, like they will try and find how to make filmmaking, and they feel so left out of the system because they don't know where to ask.
Yeah.
So this is the opportunity for them to know these are the doors that you have to knock if you want to keep creating or want to start creating content within your voice. Where did you get your funding and what do you usually use? Let's start with La Ultima Gira, with the last tour, and then we go to the documentary.
I think in both cases, it was the same structure. It doesn't necessarily work like this with every film. But I'm going to speak with regards to Puerto Rico because it's very different, and all of the other countries is very different.
Sorry,
Puerto Rico.
Before you do Puerto Rico, do you do co-productions with other countries?
Not in these two projects, I did not. But I think they're a phenomenal way to raise funding and also broaden your market. And Puerto Rico has a film program, and it has to do with incentives that they give film projects. It's been going on since 1999. I would say it's one of the longest film incentives programs in the world. I think it's started very close with Canada. So we have a very strong program, and out of that program, you start building. We have a 40% tax credit on everything that you spent locally, and a 20% tax credit of all the above and below the line non-resident talent that comes to work in Puerto Rico. Now, with the non-resident talent, I only bring actors that I want to work with that are Puerto Rican, but not necessarily live in the island. But with the rest, vendors and the crew, I only hire local because I think they're the best for the job, and also because they give for every dollar spent in a local resident, you get a tax credit. So the tax credits, their tax incentives are not, they're not 100% of your production. We also brought in investors that can, have a return on investment of the tax credits, but also get a cut of the sales. So in the case of both projects, it was a mix of tax incentives and private investment.
Question for that. So if I were to be a young filmmaker and I have a great script, whatever, it's been rewritten many times, it's gone through, tons of ghostwriting, and it's gone through the process where a lot of people have actually vetted the script for it to be made. It's a great idea, but the only caveat is that I, the writer, want to direct it and I want to make it my way or the highway. It's my way or that's it. Where do I knock? Like, do I go to the Puerto Rican Film Commission and they will connect me with these investors, or are there offices? Like, how does it work? Because I have no clue.
Yes, there is an office, but my suggestion would be to have a producer on board before knocking on the film office, because that if you're a young filmmaker, you may not have as much experience in knowing what a script might cost. So for me to knock on the film office's door, I need to know how much that film is going to cost. And for me to do that, I need to break down that script. And for that, you need a producer and somebody that's going to tell you how much this is going to cost, and is going to give you an overview of, all right, this is $1 million project because you have 25 days to shoot. It's in the 1960s. So it's a period piece. So there are certain factors that can, will tell you what a script is going to cost. Before you go to the film office, you need to understand what your film is, because they're gonna, you're gonna ask for credits and they're gonna reserve a tax credit amount for you. You need to understand the process. So if you know the process, you can go straight to the film office and try to get a tax credit reserve by going through the entire application process. But if you don't, my suggestion would be you don't necessarily need to engage a producer. I speak to young filmmakers all the time, and I'm an advocate for trying to make their films happen. I think that small, big projects, it doesn't matter. As long as people are creating and as long as people are working, I think it's great. And if there's any way I can help them make their film happen, I will. But I think my suggestion would be to speak to a local producer. You don't necessarily have to engage them, but, and they may not have the time to read the entire script, but, you should be able to provide a copy and, discuss what the story is about and kind of get a sense so that person can tell you,
and
this is going to cost this.
The film incentives are as part of the film commission, or would that be?
The film incentives are managed by the government of Puerto Rico. They have a film office. Okay. So yes, you do have to go to the government and through the application process, and they will reserve a tax credit amount for you. Okay. A lot of Puerto Rican films, the Film Act allows for an advance, and you can get an advance if you have a bond. So let's say, to give you an example, again with $1 million project, you have $1 million project, a 40% tax credit is $400,000 in tax credits. You have to sell that because it's a tax credit, a transferable tax credit. You sell it in order to get the money to make the film. You have to sell it at a discount. So you sell it at 90 cents a dollar. So that $400,000 in tax credit reserve ends up being
$360,000, $370,000.
So you have $1 million, you're covered with 300 and something, and then you have the rest that you need to fill. That's where private investors come in. That's where sponsors come in, be it because they give you cash or product placement, or because they're giving you something. They might not give you cash, but they're giving you something that's going to take away from something that you would have had to pay. For instance, with the wardrobe department, they're phenomenal. All these stores, they don't give you cash, but they allow for you to use their clothes. And then, that's a big chunk of money that you didn't have to spend. So you really have to be very creative, at least in Puerto Rico, to be able to have all those elements together. You have the tax credit reserved for you. Then you have the private equity investors, however you structure that portion, and then you have the sponsors, product placement, and the rest. So
did that structure work? How did you apply that to a documentary for the Gallos?
At a smaller scale.
Smaller scale.
In the case of the documentary, we didn't have sponsors. We had a private investor they lent us the money against the credits. But building up that relationship with the private investors is also a process, because if you just straight out of film school, they're not going to just hand you $1 million. You need to have a history of, work experience where you're responsible for that $1 million, not only of getting it, spending it, but also, and more importantly, returning it. Because a lot of investors don't necessarily care for films. They're just there to, you know, invest their money and get the money back. So they're not necessarily in there for the arts. A lot of them are, because the film business is a high risk business. What's considered in
It's definitely high risk. It's high risk. It's very
high
volatile.
risk. You never know if people are gonna like the film
Or it's gonna flunk, yeah.
gonna crash, or so
Yeah.
that portion of the financing that you're going to return from the sales of a film is tricky, because those usually are the people that love films, and they don't, you know, they care if they don't get the money back, but you know, they also see it as an investment to the arts and the culture of a country, in this case, Puerto Rico.
And again, within the framework of our conversation, how many investors do you have which are women versus men, and or BIPOC, LGBTQ, you know, Q?
Yes. I have, well, there's the 3 executive producers. I would say 2 are with, no, I'm sorry, it's 4 executive producers. 2 are with Hard Cash. 1 is with, because what this executive producer did was it connected you to other, they don't necessarily put in
Like a
cap,
pool.
but they have a pool of contacts that can again lower the amount of money that you need to spend in certain area. So I consider that an investment, because it's money that I didn't have to spend. It's money that I, you know, I could save in that area, and then I put it somewhere else. And then you have a guarantor, a person that puts, you know, a signature as a guarantee. So that's another type of executive producer. They didn't put necessarily the cash, but they did put the credit, their credit on the film. So it's
I know it's tricky, and I'm sorry I keep asking, but it's, to me, it's really important to know, like, you know, just recently there was there were I think it was the Whitney Museum, which in their board members, they had very little representation of either Latino, and they were doing like these projects, basically investing money in communities and workshops, etc. And there was no Latino on the board. So my question, again, from your perspective, not necessarily like a specific like Excel sheet, spreadsheet, but what is your general feeling? Are they LGBT crew, BIPOC, or women-based investors or not? Is it mostly male? Is it, you know, what have you seen?
It's mostly male. At least in my recent experiences have been mostly male. I don't know if it was because I didn't present the opportunity to a woman. I don't, you know, pool of people that were available to or interested in investing. I didn't speak to women.
Okay.
I don't know if it's because they are not interested in film. I doubt it. I'm interested in film and in myself. So
yeah, no judgment. I'm just trying to figure out like, you know, if that is something that is common, because I don't know. I really don't know. I'm really asking the questions, because I would be surprised if someone comes to me and says like, well, you know what? I actually work with only women investors. What? You know, like, you know, it would be really interesting to know what goes behind. And if this is what it goes, you know, perfect. This is what we're managing. It's information as content creators that we need to know as to like how to manage our sales pitches, or
that tells you a lot also. That tells you a lot. I think it's a microcosm of really who is in charge of money, at least easy, or I don't know if you can call it easy money, but you know, money that you can just trade back and forth or invest in a film. I don't know if we need more women in the financing world, most definitely. But I think what I'm happy with is to see more women in leadership roles, because yes, the investors have the money to make the film, but they're giving it to women to make these films.
Yeah, I agree.
They trust me to handle their investment. So in the end, we just want, I mean, at least I want more women to have those leadership roles. And the money can come from anywhere. We just want the women to be in charge of making these films happen, and of making sure that we tell women's stories. That's something that I talk to a lot of filmmakers and directors about, is that my last few films have not been about a woman's story. And I always complain, because I'm usually like, but there needs, the last tour, the original script, the main character, it was there. The intent to have women, get more protagonism, or however you want to call it. The intent is there. I know men filmmakers want it to happen.
Agreed.
It's just a matter of it getting it in the script, and not for the sake of it, but because it is part of our world, because our stories are very important. I mean, to say the least, in every story, it's not a man's world. It's a woman and a man's
world.
It's everyone's world.
So we are about to close.
These conversations a lot, and also with minorities, and how minorities are portrayed in films. My conversations, they have two sides to the debate, which is, okay, so in this case, the man that was the killer was a Black person. So what do you do with that character? Do you turn him white? But in the true story, he was Black. But then people say, oh, but you're perpetuating, that Black men are the bad guys, right? But in this story, it was a true story, he was Black. So those conversations happen a lot. I mean, how do you reconcile reality with trying to be more conscious about certain things? I remember,
which in turn feeds the whole conversation, because if you sit down and say, well, me creating this will perpetuate an idea of a minority being vilified, then you have to ask the sociological question and anthropological question and historical question. What's the context, and how am I portraying it to explain why this character is being portrayed in a negative light within my script? Like, you either choose to have the conversation with the audience, or you do not. And if you do not, then you are being part of the continuum of, misrepresentation.
That's why it's important that those conversations happen. And if there needs to be a change in the script because of those conversations, then there should be.
And it could be, the idea is to have them in the round table before you start shooting, because once it's shot, it's done, it's in the can. So I have 2 minutes or 3 minutes more before we finish our interview. And I usually open the question to everyone to have like whatever you feel you need to say, or just guide it, whichever thing you choose. As in, what is your biggest pet peeve in the industry that you would like to change, or I don't know, like suggestion? What do you feel could be something like, just don't think too much about it. It's just que te viene a la mente.
With what I think should change in the industry in general, or
general pet peeves. Like someone once told me, "Oh, I want a babysitting department," and I was just like,
I love that. I do babysitting department too. I think it should be a trailer for kids. Perfect idea. I'm all for it. I do have something that I'm always constantly thinking when I choose the stories that I want to produce. With Latin American stories, I feel that there's a tendency for other countries and festivals to choose films that show Latin America, the poor Latin America, the sad or depressive stories, which are very important too. However, we have fantastic stories with amazing talents, musicians, and with, at least with the last tour, it is important to me to make the distinction, because it is not, you know, this story about a sad story about that's showing that Latin American, that I think a lot of people that are not from Latin America probably like to see. And I've seen that the cinematography has been consistent in the past few years, where you're showing sad stories. Again, I'm not judging what stories you choose. I think people should be free to make the story that they want or that they have the proximity to. However, I would also want to see other types of stories that are lively and funny and great and big, and I don't know, just a different tone.
I'm gonna resume this. Yeah, and there is a term for that. I heard it's called porno miseria, misery porn. Yeah, poverty porn. And basically what it does is perpetuate the idea that we are in need of aid, we are depraved. It's colonial mentality, but it's also a very Eurocentric mentality. And yes, I do agree that we can tell other stories.
Yeah, and a lot of these films are wonderful films, worthy of, you know, winning festivals and all that. But I would also like to see this other side of our Latin American filmmaking, which is, you know, not necessarily that. We have other stories. And that's why I love the last tour, because it wasn't that. It has to do with their music. Yes, it's a story of a man that gets to a certain age and he's forgotten, and then he's, you know, meeting this new generation of singers, and then this difference, a generational difference, but also a difference between the types of music that they, you know, produce. One is very synthesized, don't want to say it in a bad word, and the other one's more produced music with a lot of instruments. So we have that. We have a lot of great and rich stories to tell that are not necessarily that other side of our world that I've seen in the past 10 years, you know, be, you know, repetitive. And I'm saying it in a very respectful way for every story that is out there by Latin American filmmakers. I support them 100% in whatever they want to do. However, I would like to encourage people and tell them that you don't have to, if you don't necessarily have to make that film to win festivals or to, you know, have France say that you're a great filmmaker. You can make another type of story, and it will be just as good. That's it.
Well, thank you so much, Nadia, for your time, your knowledge, your interest in filmmaking, and your creative input in most of the films, because I do know, I saw we didn't get to talk too much of each film because that was not this the intent of this series, but I did enjoy very much. Say again.
No, they're very different films. I mean,
they're very different, but I love the fact that I know your work, and I know that it goes back and forth between documentary or like very commercial, like narrative, like fiction narrative, or very dramatic films. And I have seen that throughout the years. So thank you, because I know that seriously, you're one of the best producers that I know, and I really respect what goes behind. So I'm gonna stop the recording and stay in.
For your time, your talent, and for everything that you do for our cinematography. It's wonderful working with you, and it's wonderful having you hosting these chats, because that's where ideas, start to emerge and good things happen. So thank you.
Well, thank you again for being here and behind those scenes with Aris Mejias, part of the PHLAFF Film Festival. Ciao.